I think that it's reasonable to divide different groups of humans into subspecies, and that calling these subspecies races is an excellent idea. I recently watched some videos and read some articles which disagree with me, so in this video I'm going to respond to all of them and demonstrate to you how silly they all are. You know those memes that show two wolves which look exactly the same, and then they show a German and an Aboriginal, and they say something like, "Why are the wolves a different subspecies, but the German and Aboriginal aren't?" That's basically what this video is going to be, but I'll be going into a little bit more detail. By the end, I hope to show you that the people who made these memes, silly and oversimplified as they may seem, are smarter, more honest, more decent human beings, and have more common sense than the people who wrote these impressive looking articles. These are the main arguments I could find opposing the idea of splitting human groups into races. You can go ahead to any question you're interested in by using the timestamps. Also, sources and extra musings from me can be found in the documents in the description. Let's start from the beginning, that the differences between the races are too small to justify separating them. Here is a guy who says this.
Certain kinds of molecular sequences are more common in some groups than in other groups. But the first thing to say about that is that these differences are trivial.
Trivial?
Largely trivial. There are some cases, as well-known diseases, that tend to affect some groups more than others. That is not trivial for the sufferers. But by and large, these differences are perfectly trivial.
We're actually off to a bad start. I have to concede this first point. He's right about this. Look at these two pictures and try to tell the difference between them. I know, right? It's really difficult. Their differences are really trivial, but if I was forced to think of something, I guess I would say that these people are slightly less susceptible to malaria. That's the main difference that really stands out for me. These sorts of arguments aren't only about subjective perception. They often try to measure genetic relatedness of two populations using the fixation index, or FST. This guy is claiming that the FST between human races is too small to justify a subspecies classification. So, what is the fixation index and how is it calculated? You start by sequencing a section of DNA in one person. Then you measure the same section in a bunch of other people who belong to the same group. The percentage of letters which are different are recorded, which allows you to get the within average. Then you do the same thing, except you compare it to people from another group. This is the between average. To get the fixation index, you use this equation. In my example, the variation within is 20% and between is 40%, so the fixation index will be 0.5. If there is no variation between groups, then the FST will be 0, and if the two groups are really distant, it will approach 1. You can see that the numbers will change dramatically depending on the in-group that you use, so most sensible people don't take it too seriously. It's best to think of it as a way of getting a ballpark estimate. This guy on Reddit found a video which he thinks proves that human races don't exist. Let's watch some of it.
The FST for modern humans is approximately 0.110, or we could say 11%. Wright himself proposed that a subspecies should be considered valid when this FST value exceeded 0.25. Humans don't even make it halfway to the standard criteria, so objectively, by the standard taxonomic practices governing subspecies, human populations don't qualify as subspecies.
My response to this is to point my finger at him and say, no, what you're saying is really bad. Nobody else agrees with your definition of subspecies, and even if they did, it would be a terrible one anyway. If you search for papers that give the fixation index between different species, you would see that an FST below 0.25 is pretty common. In fact, if they're the same genus or family, it's probably more common than being above that number. This means that you'll have many examples of plants or animals which are a different species, but according to Wright's definition are the same subspecies.
Now think about that. That does not make sense.
I feel a bit bad for him. When he came up with his definition, it wasn't necessarily written in the stars that it would contradict the definition of species so catastrophically. This is why nobody, except these guys on Reddit, trying to disprove the idea of race, actually use it. The most common definitions of subspecies are soft, normally saying something like this. So it's not about physical characteristics alone, and it's certainly not about fixation index. It's about taking into account a combination of physical and behavioral differences, as well as whether there has been geographic isolation between them. Very soft. So, are human races subspecies? To decide this, the question you'll always fall back on is, do you want them to be? Let's do an activity together. Pretend that you're a taxonomist and you've had a big day at work. You've just finished classifying all these types of tigers, and you've decided that they're all different subspecies because they live in different areas and they look kind of different. Then your coworker appears. He's just got back from a trip to Europe and Africa, and he took footage of the behavior, culture, art, architecture, and music of the people in both those places, and he's asked you to classify them. Now, I did try to find the best examples of those things for Africa. It wouldn't have been a fair comparison if I just showed a bunch of mud huts for them. Although, to fill the minute, I did have to include a few mud huts, but that notwithstanding, I promise I did try to find the best from each. So let's watch and try to make up our own minds together. Do these groups differ enough to justify them being a separate subspecies? Now it's time to look at the Europeans. I'm going to say yes. But it's possible that some people will still say that we're not that different. And that's when you bring out the big guns. It's time to bring up the fact that Aboriginals and some African populations like Pygmies exist. These are probably the two most distantly related groups, and of all the articles and videos by race deniers, I have not yet seen one where they've acknowledged data for these two groups. So, why is their existence so often overlooked by the race deniers?
Because it's devastating to my case!
As you know, the average FST between most people of different races is between 0.11 to 0.15, depending on which paper you read. But out of curiosity, what do these numbers look like for Aboriginals? To find out, I went to the website for the Human Genome Project and tried searching for DNA sequences by race, specifically Aboriginal sequences. I would then be able to calculate their approximate FST with other groups. But when I went to their archive and searched by race, the website got really angry at me, and it started yelling at me, saying, "Race is an ideology, and for this reason many scientists believe that race should be more accurately described as a social construct, and not a biological one." So I was like, okay, fine, I'll look for it somewhere else. I couldn't find the Aboriginal sequences anywhere obvious, so I emailed some of the guys who did the research, but none of them replied back to me. This was annoying because I know this information exists somewhere. The situation where one group has information and they aren't sharing kind of reminds me of things which were happening 500 years ago. During the Protestant Reformation, there were peasants who went to their local priests and said things like, Can you please translate the Bible into English or German so we can understand it? And the priests were like, no, go back to your farm. After being dismissed by these geneticists, I finally understand what John Wycliffe and Martin Luther must have felt. I did eventually find papers that got the full autosomal FSTs for almost all races. I just have to trust that they did it honestly. Looking at them, you can see that for races on different continents, lots of them are above 0.2 and even 0.3 when compared to Africans, and that between Aboriginals and Pygmies, it gets as big as 0.43. This is so distant that they even adhere with Sewell Wright's idiotic definition of subspecies, and they might even border on being a separate species. Good news! I eventually found some mitochondrial genomes and I used them to calculate some of my own indices. I got 0.18 between Europeans and Papua New Guineans. If you want to see how and why I did that, and my conclusions, you can check the source doc. Anyway, next is the fuzzy boundaries argument. Here is a website making it. It says, the study of human genetics challenges the traditional concept of different races of humans as biologically separate and distinct. This is validated by many decades of research, including recent examples. Citation, citation, citation. Most human genetic variation is distributed as a gradient, so distinct boundaries between population groups cannot be accurately assigned. This is an argument I hear a lot, but subjective or fuzzy boundaries do not make concepts illegitimate. Even though you might be unsure about what to call this color, the words red, blue, and purple are still useful because being slightly misled by a person who has a different idea of where to draw the lines is far better than not having those words at all. I'm not sure if this sort of argument they are using has a name, but from now on I'm going to call it the gay retard conjecture. So even though it is subjective, I'm going to talk about a way of classifying races which I like. This is called a cluster analysis, where the computer will work out a way to divide the population into groups, so that the average distance between each data point and the group center is as small as possible, and the genetic distance could be measured as FST or GST or a few other things. So this is what the computer would go for, but this would not. After deciding how many clusters you want, something like this will be spat out. The more of one color that you have, the closer you are to the center of that cluster, and the more alleles you share with other members of that group. You can see from this picture that most Bantus, Mandankas, and Yarrabahs fall into the same cluster. Having gradients in this sort of analysis is no problem. Gradient schmadiant. So this leaves the question. If you want a way of classifying races which has a genetic basis and can give nice results in spite of fuzzy boundaries, why not run a cluster analysis for the whole world? And we could, but there is just one problem. Let's keep reading from the website. There is considerable genetic overlap among members of different populations. Such patterns of genome variation are explained by patterns of migration and mixing of different populations throughout human history. In this way, genetics exposes the concept of racial purity as scientifically meaningless. They actually have a point here. Defining pure races or drawing boundaries between groups could be easy in theory by just doing the cluster analysis, but the fact that humans have been migrating and breeding with each other makes these calculations insanely more difficult. Because of that, what they're saying here is relevant. This is why, as of today, nobody has been able to do a worldwide cluster analysis, because the complexity from interbreeding is just too much for the computers to handle. Scientists once tried to run this analysis at the Atlanta Public University, APU, but the array of supercomputers started overheating and they had to shut it down. The reason why interbreeding makes racial categorization so much more difficult is that, Oh wait, sorry, I made a mistake. It makes literally zero difference to anything. Sorry. Here's the cluster analysis for the whole world. When it splits the world into two clusters, or k equals 2, it puts Africans, Europeans, Arabs, and Central Asians into one, and everyone else in the other. When k equals 3, Africans break off. This one is interesting because in the 17 and 1800s, some people divided humans into 3 groups called Caucasoids, Negroids, and Mongoloids. They divided people how you might expect, but they included people in the Middle East, Iran, and Pakistan as Caucasoids, exactly the same as the k equals 3 clustering. To my amazement, these classifications by people like Huxley and Myers, who just sort of looked at people and used good old-fashioned intuition, were absolutely bang on. One trend that I've noticed after looking into this stuff for a while is that the prejudices and bigotries of ye-old racists from hundreds of years ago are constantly being validated by 21st century statistics and molecular genetics, while they are almost never being refuted. Native Americans split from Asians when k equals 4. Then at 5, people from New Guinea and Aboriginals break off. The first somewhat surprising thing happens at k equals 6. Here, a small isolated population known as the Kalash, who live in the mountains in northern Pakistan, break off. Central Asians and Arabs stay with Europeans for some time, which gives legitimacy to the meme that the Taliban are whiter than the American army. I had to get another source to find a k equals 7 map. Here, North Africans and Arabs break away from Europeans. I'm sorry, the source for this one is behind a paywall. I know what I'm doing is bad. I sincerely apologize. Anyway, I made some maps for k equals 6 and 7, showing the majority cluster in different parts of the world before 1500. Here is the 6 map, and here is 7. Not every ethnic group was tested, so if you're curious about the clustering of any in particular, you may need to look them up separately. Also, there are a few minority groups, especially in Europe, who do not cluster very well with their surrounding group. Having said that, I know what you're all thinking, and the answer to your question is that that particular group is pretty close to being in the middle of Europeans and Middle Easterners. After reading a fair chunk of papers that look at specific alleles, it is really hard to tell who they're closest to. My way of thinking about race is pretty close to k equals 7. The k equals 6 one basically says that Arabs, Pakistanis, and Iranians are all white, and that Jews are definitely white as well. Therefore, k equals 6 shall be known as the Jared Taylor approved map. Don't get me wrong though, there are some benefits to this one. We'd get to say that Jesus was white and we was kings, although it's us, so we just say we were kings. We'd also get to say that Hannibal was white, and so on. But I still like the 7 map better. However, there's no reason why we can't predefine our own clusters. Given the choice, I think I would probably divide the races this way, because most people recognize all these groups, and in order to communicate with each other, we need races that people actually recognize. Nobody knows who the Kalash people are. Sorry, but you guys can just be Central Asians. If you want to generate this, you tell the computer what alleles Indians, Southeast Asians, and Jews have. Then it can just include those groups when it's working out who you're closest to. The point of the other cluster maps I showed you was to merely demonstrate that the computer divided people fairly similarly to our own intuition, showing that we are on the right track, and that if you're autistic and want dividing lines which are as objective as possible, those maps are still available for you. So in this picture, the correct position is this guy. By the way, I tried to find a fat cartoon character from Innuendo Studios, but I couldn't. So to make it more realistic, just pretend that this guy is fat. And if I'm being completely honest, maybe us as well. Now let's watch a video by Vox, which talks about how racial classifications were used to oppress people.
You may think you know exactly what race you are, but how would you prove it if someone disagreed with you? The fact is, even though race drives a lot of social and political outcomes, race isn't real. One of the first people to attempt to categorize humans according to race was a German scientist around 1776. He came up with 5 different groups according to physical appearance and geographic origin of their ancestors.
That's really close to k equals 5. This guy did an excellent job.
Americans of European descent eagerly bought into this type of thinking around the same time. Some historians have said the idea that there were different races helped them resolve the contradiction between a natural right to freedom and the fact of slavery. If whites were their own distinct category, then they could feel a lot better about denying freedom to people who they labeled black and decided were fundamentally different.
They didn't decide we are fundamentally different. We are different. This presenter thinks that it was our classifications that caused people to think slavery was okay, but it wasn't. Bad things can be built on truthful foundations, but it's the untrue foundations that are to blame. Otherwise, all you're really endorsing is lying. Also, the point of my video is merely to argue that race exists. I would never argue that one race is superior to another.
The idea that someone might look one way and identify another way, or that they might be really hard to place in a racial category, is not new. This is why there was a public debate about whether MSNBC's Karen Finney could say she was black, or how we can't even agree on the racial label assigned to the President of the United States.
I'd say Obama is mixed race, but black is certainly also acceptable. 50-50 people could cluster with the race of either parent, but whatever happens, they'll be very close to the border. That's why I think calling them mixed race is more informative. People like to look at situations like this and say stuff like, what race is Barack Obama? His mum was white and his dad was black. This is such a puzzle, I am so confused. But I say, no, this is not confusing. You're just pretending to be. The amount of admixture needed to put someone in this or that category is subjective, that's true, but the people in this video are using this subjectivity to throw their hands up in the air and argue that race doesn't exist at all. So this is actually another attempt at the gay retard conjecture.
Of course, many people feel their racial identity is very clear and very permanent. But the fact that some people have changed theirs and that no one can really argue with them shows how shaky the very idea of race is.
I argue with people about what race they are all the time.
This is all because there isn't a race chromosome in our DNA that people can point to. It simply doesn't exist.
That sentence doesn't mean anything. Anyway, let's move on to the next point, that the term the human race exists. This video is called Racism Destroyed in 1 Minute.
Why do we hate?
We hate because we're taught to hate. We hate because we're ignorant. We're the product of ignorant people who have been taught an ignorant thing, which is that there are 4 or 5 different races. There are not 4 or 5 different races. There's only one race on the face of the earth, and we're all members of that race, the human race.
Well, from my point of view, there are 4 to 5 different races. What's remarkable about this lady is the matter-of-fact way that she makes an argument based entirely on a trick of semantics. What drives people like her is that they want language to reflect their ideology. I suppose I do as well, but at least my way has some benefits. For one thing, don't you think it's convenient having words to distinguish between these different groups? It allows us to more easily identify people and talk about racial issues. Insisting on the broadest definition of race only really serves to make communication on the topic more difficult. And the fact that calling black people black and white people white makes communication easier is an indication that it reflects biological reality. So I would argue that using those words is entirely proper. But having said that, how do most academics use the word race? According to this article, the majority don't acknowledge race, at least not publicly. But there's still a decent minority who are open race acknowledgers. So if someone brings up an argument from authority saying there is a scientific consensus against race, you can show them these numbers and effectively bypass sophist land. In the future, I predict that the percentage of academics who deny race will increase. And I also think that many will be forced into the closet. And for a university professor, this is a closet which actually takes courage to come out of. This will effectively make it impossible to break through to certain types of people. But whatever happens, most people who are free thinkers, in the true sense of that word, will still think of race the way I do. These are the people who may not know big fancy words, but they have integrity in the things that they say, who speak to the point rather than relying on rhetoric, and don't shy away from hard truths. They are pure-hearted, salt-of-the-earth people, yet are dissidents when they face a hostile authority. Some live in pastoral English cottages, while others spend most of their time at home posting on 4chan, the former tending to their livestock, the latter tending to their memes. They are simple folk, who may not all be book smart, but they have wisdom, because, as the old saying goes, the beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper name, and they do this, even when most of the world is against them. So I'd rather have them on my side in this debate than all the academics on Earth. The next argument is that there is more diversity between chimps than humans.
Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin, and who was in some ways the founder of human genetics, because he wrote a book called about the inheritance of genius. He automatically assumed that there were huge differences in between different humans, but they were partitioned to different groups, not different individuals. And this led him to make some very unfortunate comments about the intellectual excellence or otherwise of different groups. He assumed that if groups look different on the skins, they must be different in their bloods, their bones and their brains. And he wrote a notorious paper called Africa for the Chinese, where he said that the Chinese were so much cleverer than the Africans that they should move into Africa and take it over, because the differerences were so great biologically and intellectually between the groups. And that was the feeling, really, I remember even when I was a student in Edinburgh. People, we were all very liberal and left-wing, but that was the model that people had of human difference. It was there, and it was between the continents, not between people.
It's both.
And in fact, both here at UCL, University College London, and elsewhere, but first of all here at University College London, in the 1960s, that assumption was blown out of the water. And it was blown out of the water by Harris and Hopkinson in what now seems an absurdly simple way. You've got to remember that in the 1960s...
He rambles on for a few minutes. I'll cut to the point.
And in the human context, the results were basically astonishing, because the strong expectation that there would be differences between the races of the world hasn't really held up.
Yes, it has.
If you look at the amount of genetic diversity in different human populations, when we look at proteins, it's tiny compared to the amount of genetic diversity between, shall we say, two groups of chimpanzees that look almost the same, that live a few hundred kilometers apart.
So his claim is that the differences between humans are small, and there's more diversity between chimp groups than human races. Here's the paper he's talking about. These numbers are not the fixation index. They are the proportion of haplotypes in each genome that is shared with the other group. All you really need to know is that the bigger numbers tend to mean a closer relationship. There is a greater genetic distance between the blue chimps and the other two chimp groups than between the sampled human races, but on the whole, it's pretty close. This guy said that the genetic diversity between humans are tiny compared to chimps.
There is only a tiny little genetic difference between us, really tiny.
But it's not. We're super close to the chimps. And even these results are really not that surprising, because the blue and yellow chimps have been evolving separately for 500,000 years, about 300,000 years longer than us. Meanwhile, the red and yellow chimps are about as different as humans are. People say these chimps are living in the same forest, separated by a little river, and are as diverse as human races. And I say, yeah, but they still haven't bred with each other for hundreds of thousands of years. So what point are you trying to make? The reason chimps look similar is that they evolved in similar environments. But the fact that they've been separate for longer means there will be more silent mutations between them, as well as the uptake of similar but different alleles over time, which helps explain the results of the paper. My counter is that dog breeds are about as closely related to each other as human races from different continents, and they look pretty different. I would also mention the Aboriginal Neanderthal counter. Oh, by the way, if anyone's interested, in the source doc below, I have a more in-depth discussion about whether I think Aboriginals should be classified as humans in the first place. It was a really, really close call. Next is when people say we are all Africans as a way to delegitimize race.
First off, I would like to start off, Dr. Dawkins. I'm noticing that wonderful shirt you have on right now. It says that we are all Africans. Now,
Boo. Boo.
Now, that's easy for you to say. You were born in Kenya. So, for those of us not born in Kenya, could you please explain why we are all Africans?
If you look at the amount of variation in the human species genetically, it's extremely low. We are a very, very uniform species compared to other species, even chimpanzees. It's been said that if you take two chimpanzees from the same forest in Africa, they're likely to be more different from each other genetically than any two humans in the world. It's a bit surprising when you consider that we, to our eyes, at least look more different. But the genetics is very clear that we are an astonishingly uniform species. We are all one species, one very uniform species, and we originate very recently in Africa. We are all Africans.
My response can be summed up with this meme. We are not the same as the groups we evolved from. It's true that our ancestors lived in Africa 1 million years ago, but that doesn't mean we're Africans. Why not go back further? Tiktaalik fossils, which is the fish that first came out of the water, are all found in Canada. Therefore, according to you, we mammals, birds, and reptiles are all Canadians. A very disturbing thought indeed. The final argument against race, which I could find, is that thinking in these terms started as late as the transatlantic slave trade. that its recent and problematic appearance in human history takes away some of its legitimacy. This is the main answer you get when you Google the origin of racial thought. I'll read one of the sources that says this, then respond to it. Race and its ideology about human differences arose out of the context of African slavery. No, it didn't. Okay, that basically sums everything up. To highlight the main things, it's easy to define human races. There are enough genetic differences and, I think, observed characteristics to separate humans into those races. And it's just a good idea to do that. Not doing it makes communication harder. I haven't been sarcastic in the last few minutes, so I'll finish by saying that if you ever see a speciesist, that is, someone who thinks that there are differences between animal species, call them an incel and tell them that we are one domain, the eukaryotic domain, and then inform them that we are all Canadians. Thank you for watching my video about Race A, and if it offended anyone, then I sincerely apologise.
How about claiming that, they are actually a whole separate race, when actually white DNA comes from the black female?